Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to our conversation in room. This is session 4 of day 2 of our conference. And I'm very pleased to chair this session today and introduce our speakers. The panel is called Religious Organizations and Peacemaking, Part 1. The first presenters are Tetiana, Kalenychenko, and
Recording in progress.
Wanner, who will speak and present jointly. Catherine will be in person and Tetiana will be online, with the title of a paper being Religious Actors and Creating a Culture of Dialogue During the War. I'm also pleased to welcome our second speaker, Ihor Poshyvailo, who has just opened a wonderful exhibit about destroyed temples of Ukraine. The exhibit is wonderful. The topic, of course, is very gloomy. Ihor will be speaking about identity war in Ukraine, religion and culture on the battlefield. And then we will welcome our commentator, Professor Jeff Stepnisky of MacEwan University, who will then reflect on papers. Thank you very much. Please, first presenters.
Thank you very much, Natalia, and thanks to everyone for being here. I'll begin, and then Tanya will pick up, and we'll close together. You know, we've been talking, sort of thinking of war, both from a legal and a theological and other kinds of perspectives. And we've noticed the extent to which we very often have what's got up to be called sort of dualism, these kinds of binary categories. And I think that's where difficulties tend to emerge, especially when those binary categories end up clashing with reality. Usually, in a war kind of situation, there's an official declaration, and there's certainly 2 or more armies that are uniformed, and they have insignias showing who is who, and all kinds of other rules and regulations that tend to shape the experience of war. Already, this conflict is very, very different. The full-scale invasion was preceded by a hybrid war, where not only guns were used, but a whole variety of things, including religion, and especially religion, one could even say, were weaponized within this conflict. But this sort of the hybrid war phase leading into I think will really give way to something of a hybrid peace kind of a phase. In other words, if the preceding 10 years in many respects have not followed many of the usual dynamics that we have come to expect in a war kind of a context, I think the same can be said in the war's aftermath. And so our presentation today really embraces the element of the possible in the title of this paper. I speak for Tanya when I say the 2 of us are inveterate optimists, and we're 2 women with lots of energy, and so we are forward-looking, and we're thinking about what is possible in this case. Many of the earlier presentations have noted the extent to which many changes and adaptations to the context of war have involved developing new kinds of markers to delineate who is a friend and who is a foe, whether one speaks about changes to the calendar or changes to icons. All of these things are the kinds of markers that begin to create the kinds of boundaries that separate one group from another group. That aspect of the war, of course, will carry over into the post-war period. I should say, my own contribution as someone who I consider myself an ally of Ukraine. I'm not Ukrainian, I don't live in Ukraine, but as an ally of Ukraine, I have the benefit of being able to think perhaps further in the distance and over time. And that's what, together with Tanya, we're trying to do in this presentation, to take a very long view, not just of the war, but the war's aftermath. And in doing so, we settle on the fact that religious institutions offer unique resources in terms of reckoning with not just the war as it is ongoing now, but especially in its aftermath. We've spoken a lot about the perils that religion introduces. In other words, it can very often be an inflammatory and divisive force. I certainly by no means wish to deny that or in any way underestimate that. Having said that, it's also important to recognize that religious organizations also share several attributes that I think could be helpful going forward. In other words, they really have a presence across Ukraine, broadly across Ukraine, and everything from small villages to large towns, given that they have something of a hierarchical authority structure, you have some degree of accountability, and they propose certain kinds of communities that are there. In short, although religious institutions, as this entire conference has been dedicated to examining, religious institutions potentially could play a very divisive role in Ukrainian society, they also could potentially play quite a unifying role. And so we're trying to think about the way in which we can maximize that unifying potential. We're motivated by the fact that, taking stock of the fact that it's going to be extremely important to encourage a sense of inclusivity. In fact, even incorporating inclusivity in the kind of political and civil culture going forward. I think it's going to be difficult. It's always difficult under any circumstances, but let alone during war and a war's aftermath, to begin to scope out what are the priorities for pursuing the common good and to trying to marshal the will to address them. One of the ways in which this has been done in Ukraine to date is by a group called Dialogue in Action, Dialogue v Dії, and this is something that Lydia and Denise have also been involved in. It was a group that was created in 2016, and Tanya was very active since 2016. I've also participated in many of the facilitated dialogues that they've held prior to COVID in Western Ukraine, and then during the war, more recently in Western Ukraine once again. So the goal of Dialogue in Action is via facilitated dialogues, and what I mean by that is dialogues that have professionally trained mediators participating. The goal is then to try to transform conflicts, not to solve them, not to propose solutions, not to in any way impose a vision, but to try to transform the way in which people see sources of dispute, the way in which people perceive the origins and the consequences of particular disputes. And the overall goal is to try to quell social tensions. Initially, many of the facilitated dialogues addressed a great many what could almost be seen as mundane considerations, such as which roads to renovate, or addressing problems with trash collection, or what to do with communal properties. These kinds of classic anthropological sort of interests in sort of everyday life. So in that sense, what started with these kinds of mundane considerations, sort of in the spirit of self-organization after the Maidan, began to change over time and to take on other kinds of interests. And so certainly within the conditions of war, I mean, we're quite obviously facing a population that is traumatized, to say the very least, and also one that is reckoning with the reality that a good bit of the country's infrastructure will have to be rebuilt. So I want to turn to some of the kinds of social tensions that have developed in Ukraine more recently, going beyond these kinds of mundane considerations, and these are the kinds of issues that come up, and they have to do once again with remaking these kinds of markers. There's, on one level, quite an understandable sort of rejection of all things Russian or pertaining to Russia, Russianness and what have you, and we've seen the many ways in this as manifest in religious life and in politics as well. The trick is, very often, these kinds of rejections or reframing as to what constitutes Russia or what constitutes a manifestation of Russianness and what the meaning of that might be. Is it pro-Russian sympathy? Is it collaboration and the like? All of these kinds of additional considerations that are emerging foster all kinds of social tensions. All of this calls for then a kind of a remaking of political culture and civil society in Ukraine. For the interests of time, to cut to two of the key impending issues that we imagine to be really key in terms of generating social tension and social fragmentation. This war will end. I constantly remind myself of that. It's easy to forget it. Wars do end, and this one will end as well. But the question will be, under what conditions will it end? While many have declared this a just war to be fought, will the conditions that end this war be understood as a just peace? Already we see conflicting attitudes in Ukraine as to whether it's worth to continue fighting or whether there should be some kind of negotiation of sorts. So assessing whether a just peace has been reached, I think, will be a divisive question right off the bat, and there's likely to have many different opinions about that. Similarly, going back to the issue of diversity, I think Ukraine is destined to become an ever more diverse society. And those of us who live in North America need no convincing that one has to work at not only creating but maintaining tolerance for not just different views, different values, different lifestyles, and the like. This diversity will be driven by, of course, people being displaced within Ukraine. That is to say, people who used to live in eastern Ukraine, perhaps living in south, southern, western Ukraine, elsewhere, non-occupied territories, as well as the kind of tension that's likely to emerge between those who are returning. As we know, one very distinctive aspect of this conflict is that, of course, there has been tremendous outmigration from Ukraine. And obviously, although not all will return, a good many will. And those that return are probably, or perhaps, one hopes, will return with additional skills, perhaps with capital. And the like. And so, in other words, the kind of tensions that are likely to emerge between those who stayed and those who left and return is not insignificant. Lastly, I would mention, we don't know the exact number of casualties or the exact number of disabled people in Ukraine these days, but the number is certainly significant, very significant. And in the war's aftermath, the rebuilding of Ukraine is also going to mandate the rebuilding of the workforce. And by this, I think Ukraine is destined to become, even though it in the past has been a country where people out-migrated from, it's likely to become a place where people immigrate to. And this will be yet another source of diversity in Ukraine, integrating those immigrants who will be called upon to help rebuild Ukraine. One of the goals of these kinds of dialogues is to try to cultivate trust, and trust on multiple levels. And the idea is that trust can then perhaps begin to spill over into hope and a greater sense of empathy between or among parties that have disagreements with one another. And by empathy, I mean the ability to imagine how the other person sees the same situation. And this is really essential in order for dialogues to be productive. Another element is to recognize, and Scott mentioned this last night, just the very time-intensive nature of resolving disagreements via dialogue. Very much the long-term prospect that one has to take. I mean, the initial first slide had a child on it because I think one needs to think in terms of generations. And one needs to also formulate very specific goals so that there is some, and these tend to be very incremental goals, but very tangible goals, so that there can be a sense of having achieved a goal and moving on. And one of the main purposes, in a way, in which to build this trust, hope, and empathy is to begin to, via dialogue, break out of these binary categories. Once again, whether we're talking about Zarada Perimocha or whether we're talking about friend and foe or Russian, Ukrainian, and so on, all of these kinds of categories have to be disentangled. And one of the ways in which one does this is via dialogue, is to try to help people see others as individuals as opposed to representatives of particular groups. And the overall goal of this is to try to develop new kinds of perspectives for thinking about both the origins of the sources of discontent and then, by extension, what the possible solutions might be. And in the course of these dialogues, to begin to reaffirm the kinds of relationships that exist, and all the while underlining some of the obligations that are part of those relationships. In other words, what do perhaps neighbors owe each other? What do individuals owe their local governments or the greater national state? There's tremendous variation from place to place, and so one has to be very context specific. The overall goal of these kinds of dialogues is to begin to foster participatory forms of democratic engagement. I mean, if a good bit of this war is waged so as to avoid the kind of authoritarianism that we see in Russia, these kinds of dialogues are really grassroots democratic initiatives to try to foster a sense of empowerment and an ability to change the parameters of at least one's everyday life. Other aspects of these kinds of dialogues are to identify places, not just dialogue as a part of political culture, but also specific places where these kinds of dialogues can occur. Religious actors come in that they very often play almost a leadership kind of a role in terms of bringing people together. They can tap into pre-existing communities and trade on the very moral authority that they have to encourage others to participate. In that sense, one hopes that in the course of these dialogues that one can begin to think quite creatively about how to solve very, very tangible problems about quite simply getting along. On a final note, I would just mention that given the enormous destruction that has occurred in Ukraine, what I've called dispossession and reflects a book I just recently edited by that name. Dispossession involves the destruction of a great many things. But what also gets destroyed and what has been destroyed in this war are very often the barriers to change, some of the preconceived notions. And so one hopes that via dialogue, one can begin to really think beyond. And dialogue and action has set up a pattern whereby religious actors are very much involved, and it really rides off communities. And so in this sense, these kinds of grassroots attempts at participatory forms of democratic engagement involve religion. Nonetheless, Tanya will say a few words about some of the religious challenges that those very religious actors have.
So good afternoon to everyone and good night from Ukraine. And I'm really happy that it's possible to present, and thanks for having me online at least. And also special thanks to Catherine for our dialogue and trust in presenting and making this mutual paper. So talking and coming back to religious dilemmas. So definitely what we do see as dialogue facilitators right now and monitoring social changes through the last 2 years, intra-Orthodox conflict, unfortunately, between Ukrainian Orthodox Church and Orthodox Church of Ukraine became not only on the church level visible, but also for all Ukrainian society. And it's a sign of identity shifts and some cultural changes and cultural markers during the war. Of course, we do keep ourselves optimistic, but still to be realistic that it's needed to do something, and definitely, especially as soon as atheists are really active in this conflict too. Also, talking into dialogue culture and coming back to this issue, expansion and deepening taboos that we've got in religious communities. So it's not common to talk about war. It's not a culture at all to talk about hard topics and hot issues, which is totally against a possible uniting factor of religious actors. So as soon as churches and other religious organizations will become like places of silence, it will not help them to overcome the tensions and to find some solutions. What we can see right now in different kinds of monitorings, that's a deepening of the split after this draft of mobilization law, and especially in religious communities, because not all of them actually took a position. For example, they took a position that was against the war and they're on the side of Ukraine, but they didn't take any kind of position should their believers be mobilized or not. And especially in churches, you can hear today, like, we just pray. We pray for peace, we pray for the victory of Ukraine, but we do not talk, and especially in, for example, individual mode. If I got my document for mobilization, what should I do? Should I take alternative service? Should I serve and take weapon in my hands? It's still unpredictable. So it's also a kind of taboo, which resonating a lot, because It's like a covert ethical message that people got, like who should die for this victory and who should be alive, who is like more valuable as a person. Also, that's still an issue of international representation of our religious organizations. And I'm talking not about only all Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations, but in general. It's different perspective on different unions and charitable foundations active abroad, and sometimes a lack of information and like transparent information on what's going on and what are the needs. And of course, you've got all the reflections and mirroring of socio-political challenges on the level not only of believers, but also religious communities. Coming back to our Orthodox issue, which we've got, and I'm coming into this clerical initiatives for change, definitely I heard some of them already today, but not to mention all of them in terms of time, I would say that this intra-Orthodox issue, it's highly valuable at least to get people together in one place and at least to talk with each other, but to talk on a real issue they've got, to talk with some aim to overcome these tensions. And unfortunately, as we have got this new creation of Sophia Brotherhood, on the forms of NGO that should be like unite an organization for UOC and OCU representatives in Ukraine. A lot of priests who took active part in this meeting, they are now persecuted by their bishops, and definitely it's making it much more harder, but also visible on this problem. And of course, that's still highly contested issue of parishes in diaspora and abroad. And as soon as we've got a lot of UOC parishes open, and still silence and no readiness from ecumenical patriarchate to talk about it with OCU, because it's impossible for them to make it legally. Talking more, shifting what should be done and what could be done, definitely we need to revisit the mission, role, and approach of peace building. And by peace building now in Ukraine, we do not mean making a dialogue with Russia. We mean like building trust and hope on a social landscape inside Ukraine. And especially it's really important to start to work with it right now, as soon as after the end of the war, that would be much more tensions and divisions because people are really tired, definitely. And as soon as we lose more and more people every day, that would be really high tension conflicts, and we need to know how to deal with them, and especially on the level of religious communities. It could be really small parish in a village, but it can be also a dialogue space when it's possible to come, to feel safe, and to talk about your problems and your threats and what are you afraid of. Also, that's really important to develop a collective identity and responsibility on the level of religious community. I do not mean only like a social service and humanitarian aid, which we've got a lot, and religious actors are really active. They're active since 2013, but since 2022, they got on a different level of activity. But in general, to be active in a way of responding and thinking, and also some places where it's possible to ask questions, but not to give only answers from the priests, pastors, imams, and others. So what to focus on? So that's religious institutions, they definitely mirror many of social tensions, but they can also be a place when it's like a small laboratory, when it's possible, for example, to check new approaches, to try some dialogues, try some new meetings, maybe to get unexpected results, or maybe not like good expectations, but at least you can try and to check as soon as believers trust their religious leaders. Also, there's a still creation, I would say it's also support of horizontal networks of those who cooperate to develop them, to empower them, especially in, for example, on humanitarian aid cluster, who are working a lot with international partners, but they do not cooperate with each other. As for example, on two Caritases, because Ukraine is the only one country in the whole world which get two Caritases, one Caritas from Greek Catholic Church and one from Roman Catholic Church. And what's surprise? They do not cooperate with each other. And I hope it would be possible to overcome and at least to talk as soon as they got the same donors, the same international partners, and the same system inside. So it should be also like nurturing the culture and practices of facilitated dialogue, which already Cassie mentioned, but also on the different levels of decision making. So even just I don't know, weekly staff meeting can be facilitated in a different way when everyone can be heard and it can be really productive. And of course, it should be a huge additional focus on recovery and trauma healing, and especially for religious leaders who can make it, but they definitely need additional education, empowering, and understanding what the impact of their intervention will be. And of course, there is no illusions that it's a long-term process that should be already starting now, and especially in preparation for this post-war period of time. So maybe, Cassie, we can shift for the last slide for your also final words.
Very briefly, the overall goal of these kinds of dialogues involving religious actors is to really try to capitalize on what Peter Berger infamously called the world-making as opposed to the world-breaking potential of religious institutions. They play a key role in easing social suffering. As Marina's person said, she, like, going to Shabbat on Friday is better than seeing a psychologist. The hope of dialogue and action is that, above all, interventions now will perhaps avoid a situation when this war ends, the Russo-Ukrainian war does not spill over into a civil war in Ukraine. I think that is a very real possibility that one needs to think about and to take actions now to prevent from ever coming to fruition. And this attempt to try to have dialogue as part of political culture is to that effect. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the two presenters. I would like to invite Dr. Poshyvailo with his presentation, Identity, War in Ukraine, Religion and Culture at the Battlefield.
We can do today, how to create the platform for the post-war recovery and conciliation. I'll briefly provide you some basic information on the context and some practical responses, what we did and what we can do, what is possible for us in our situation. Usually the full-scale aggression required the responses on different levels, on political, military, religious, cultural, philosophical, public, to provide this response. And I'm sure that all of my Ukrainian colleagues evidence that it was not easy to answer the first day. The simple question from our international partners, from international institutions, what we can do for you, how we can help you. First of all, we needed to provide a kind of a situational, contextual analysis. Then we had to develop some strategies, define some priorities, identify risks, so to respond. So I will be speaking about some basic information well known to you and our response. It's, that Ukrainian culture is quite broad, and sacred monuments of architecture play a special role. Sometimes we have mixed, not identical statistics about destruction. UNESCO and some other international organizations has their own. Ukrainian Ministry of Culture provides other numbers. And sometimes they differ in several times, but it's quite understandable because different approaches, different methodologies, different even terminology and classification of cultural heritage, of monuments, collections. So it's quite considerable, and it's only 4,000 out of about 20,000 religious sites. This is on a national or local heritage list. But speaking about heritage or cultural heritage, we speak not only about buildings, collections, we speak also about the broader infrastructure, which includes cultural houses, so important to local communities. We speak about libraries, archives, cinemas, but also we speak about people. And you can see the statistics that quite a lot of people were engaged in the cultural sector in Ukraine, and they are endangered, as well as the immovable or movable heritage. I'd like to remind that in the UNESCO's World Heritage List, there are also these objects which belonged also to religious heritage. St. Sophia Cathedral, Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, you can see residency of Bukovinian and Dalmatian metropolitans, and of course the wooden churches of Carpathian in Poland and in Ukraine, and of course historical centers of Lviv and Odessa. Historical center in Odessa, where a lot of churches, as well as in Lviv, was inscribed into the UNESCO World Heritage List intentionally to protect it from Russian shelling. But as we know, it did not help. So the situation dramatically changed after 4th of February. To map the cultural heritage in Ukraine, it became quite a challenge for Ukrainian government and for Ukrainian institutions, because by the moment we don't have one systematic and verified inventory of cultural heritage objects. International colleagues from different institutions representing different organizations, including those who have satellite monitoring labs in the United Kingdom, in the United States, especially the cultural monitoring lab in Virginia, they provide, and you can see just how dense is heritage in Ukraine. The numbers of statistics of destruction, and we talked in the first day, is quite relevant, conventional, and unfortunately enlarging, not 1,800, but almost 2,000 in this situation by now. And you can see what a big part of religious sites here. Just a few pictures, famous, important, well-known objects of cultural heritage in Ukraine, like in Irpin, in Ochtyrka, and Kharkiv, and of course theater in Mariupol. A lot of monuments are damaged, including this synagogue monument near Kharkiv. A lot of museums, but historical buildings. This is a scientist house in Odessa. But let us focus on religious buildings and sacred places. And here you can see the infographics about the number of the damaged religious sites all over Ukraine. And you can see the most damaged regions, including Donetsk, Kherson, Kyiv, Kharkiv, Zaporizhia. And we also discussed about how many denominations of Ukraine and what denominations suffered mostly. And here are some basic numbers, and here much more detail. You can see. In Ukraine, we were shocked that not only Orthodox churches, which are the biggest number, despite in Soviet times a lot of them were damaged, but also there are some synagogues here included, some Islamic centers, some mosques. And of course, the numbers are not so big, and it's quite understandable for us because these religious sites were destroyed in the previous decades in last century by Soviet regime. Also some iconic religious sites like this church in Vyazivka dated 1862, and what was discussed here before, there is really a big problem even in approaching the strategies, what should be done, how to respond to this situation. This church belonged to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, affiliated with Moscow Patriarchate, and we were very surprised by their reaction to this damage. And this church was damaged in March 2022 because it seemed that they paid no much attention what should be done with the debris, with the left icons, some paintings inside, which was quite unique because they were done by local artists. We tried to approach them, we talked to them, and the response was quite surprising. The clergyman and his wife told us that the most valuable objects are already evacuated. And this territory was not limited, it was not protected, and any kind of treasure hunters can loot this church, which inside of which were a lot of really precious, from museum point of view, objects which should be mitigated. Another religious site, it is also represented on the exhibition, the brick church from Lukashivka. Russians organized kind of a military base there, interrogated people, killed some people there. Also some examples, and I will not stop focusing on them, but this is the Donetsk region. A lot of territories are mined, so sometimes it's not easy even to document and provide damage and risk assessment in these regions because still not available, and Ukraine has not enough capacities to undermine different territories. This church in Malakomyshyvailo is also very close to me because we've been there maybe a few weeks after the occupation, very close to Izium, where severe battles took place. It was abandoned as well, and it belonged also to Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and we talked to those clergymen who were responsible for it, and it seemed they displayed no interest in preserving what has left in the church. And by the way, all the icons were left intact. But this church was tested by tank, how strong it is, a lot of humidity inside. And the Russians transformed this church into a hospital. And all territory around was full of trenches, So a kind of a military base, one more military base, and a lot of explosions, a lot of mines around. And also quite dangerous, especially for local communities, because when we came, we have seen a lot of so-called stalkers, those young people who try to find something there, and absolutely very dangerous for them security. And this is also interesting church in the village of Potemkin, Kherson region. It's a Borislav region, which was also on the front lines of the recent battles. And this is a small church which was established in the former village school. You can see a trench inside it. So the religious sites, despite... Also, it's not a monument of architecture, but still, so military use it for military purposes. So documentation of damage, also very, very important for us. And this is the laboratory I mentioned before in Virginia. Interesting that they worked not only since the large-scale aggression. This laboratory was quite active in Ukraine when the war started in 2014. And they provide special reports, and they document the situation of changing not only the general landscape of historical religious landscape, but also memorial landscape. And they documented how many monuments were changed in the occupied territories by Russian occupational regimes. So very important also, and we discussed briefly during this conference about the necessity to document the crimes and to bring the perpetrators to tribunal one day. It is important to prove the intentional damage. This is the most important argument to open the trials. It's not easy, and here you can see just some representations which were proved by international colleagues. This is museum in Ivankiv, famous story close to Kiev, where some artworks by famous Maria Primachenko, whose art was favored by Pablo Picasso in particular, alongside with other famous Ukrainian naive art painters, very, very special for Ukrainian cultural identity, were kept, and the Museum of Grigory Skovoroda below. Also, there are proofs, intentional damage. Here are some also our colleagues' documentation methodology. They documented the damage by comparing the satellite images before the attack and after. And you can see that only the building is been damaged. This is before and this is after. No other buildings destroyed. And this is also one of the evidences. Another problem, of course, is looting, illicit trafficking, because international partners, custom borders, Interpol, Europol, FBI, special criminal police, they warn us that much increased illicit trafficking from Ukraine, especially archaeological and artworks. You can see one of the well-known facts of looting, also due to satellite imagery. This is the Kherson Regional Art Museum, and there are two museums, Kherson Local Museum and Kherson Art Museum, looted by Russian occupied forces. And it was a kind of a special operation because they blocked the district, not wanting to have witnesses to this crime. 20% of the Kherson Local Law Museum was looted, and more than 10,000 artworks from Kherson Art Museum. And interesting that some of the looted artworks were identified in temporarily occupied Crimea in the Museum of Central Tavrida. Much more connecting to our topic, it's also the sanitization of Ukraine is well-known directions of trying to repress Ukrainian religious freedom in different ways, repressing and persecuting the clergymen, and we told during these days about this. Also raiding the property, misusing this for military purposes, and you can see quite well-defined ways, not of course excluded, but at least the main. And also a lot of clergymen and members of religious communities were repressed, tortured, killed. And this is the story of Stepan Podolchak from Kherson region. He was kidnapped, tortured, and killed. And his wife was asked to recognize his body. And he was said by Russian occupation forces that he was dead because of the heart attack. But it was clear it's not the truth. And of course, in this situation, a lot of actions needed. You can see at least some of them, and already mentioned by Catherine and Tetiana. And of course, Tetiana mentioned that we need to create a wide network, horizontal network. It's very important, and I think this network is already being created, but we need to create also the vertical network. We have to influence the government, the decision makers, because it's important since Maidan, and I'm pleased that so many times you named Maidan in your researches, in your papers, but one of the Maidan lessons was that we were successful in on a horizontal level. We did not establish the vertical level, which could influence the politicians and provide much rapid, much more effective reforms and change of the country. And so how to respond? We created, in the first days of the war, so-called Heritage Emergency Response Initiative. In Ukrainian, it is entitled as Штаб порятунку спадщини. I suggest just to show a video which much better describes what we do than my talking.
Врятувати мистецтво від війни.
Зберегти цінні музейні експонати намагаються у штабі порятунку спадщини.
Деякі музеї дуже швидко зорієнтувалися і змогли евакуювати власні фондові збірки першої черги, або так звані платинові колекції.
Окупанти гатять прицільно по пам'ятках архітектури, по музеях, по наукових установах, бібліотеках, по церквах.
Як же так? Ну як так?
Танки стояли почти під кожною хатою.
Це було кошмар, отако все трусилося.
Слава Україні! Ми переможемо! Це наша земля. Ми відреставруємо, ми все відновимо. Но їх не буде ніколи.
Німці не зачепили церкву, а брати росіяни.
Брати росіяни зачепили.
The Ukrainian collections from museums, archives and libraries are not properly protected. Some of them were evacuated. My colleagues have done everything possible to mitigate, to minimize all the potential threats to the collections. So the situation is quite complicated because Ukraine, in fact, was not ready for such unexpected and large-scale invasion.
With the beginning of the war, we, together with Maidan Museum, created a Heritage Emergency Response Initiative to preserve Ukrainian heritage in national scale from war.
Russian occupiers have caused a lot of damage.
Зруйновано дах, зруйновано стелі, зруйновано підлогу, частково постраждало підвальне приміщення музею, повністю вибиті всі вікна.
Ukraine has more than 2,500 museums and more than 140,000 of immovable heritage. Almost 500 objects are damaged. This is only known part. Many objects on occupied territories which should be explored later. And also we did GIS, Geographical Information System, for fixation of damaged objects. We did 3D modeling with the help of photogrammetry, mostly from drones, but also from hands.
Цей півник для України є символом перемоги, перемоги над окупантами, перемогами над рашистами, символ невмирущості української нації. Українці мужньо захищають свою власну землю, і перемога буде за нами.
Actually, we are in here for a mission, for understanding better the situation in Ukraine, and we can collaborate and provide a support for protecting cultural heritage.
We wanted to see the situation, to feel what is really happening, to receive the testimonies of the people, not only from the government, but also from the communities and from the local population.
I think the most important thing that stands out for me is the resilience of the people here, on how they have rallied together to help each other in this very difficult moment. It's been a very powerful experience for me.
Had a chance to meet with the inspiring people who devote their time and put their life in danger for protecting their cultural heritage, their identity.
So ALIF will continue to stand by the Ukrainian professionals across the country.
So in other words, and to conclude, let's continue to collaborate, fight and stand strong to protect Ukraine's cultural heritage.
At this moment, we are charged with the task of shaping an agenda for the future of heritage preservation in Ukraine. This challenge is daunting. Russia's war of choice continues. The moment requires new political, social, and monetary commitments.
Ідентичність – окрема ціль для рашистських окупантів. Культурний спротив – необхідна і невід'ємна складова нашої боротьби і перемоги. За час роботи штабу порятунку спадщини ми відчули потужну підтримку з боку міжнародної спільноти. Ми вдячні всім, хто допомагає нам захищати нашу ідентичність. Згуртованість українців і солідарність світу у порятунку нашої спадщини, масштаби культурного Рамштайму увійдуть в літопис російсько-української війни окремою натхненною сторінкою. Досвід України стане важливим для збільшення стійкості світової спадщини у час кризи. Ми віримо у нашу спільну силу та успішну відбудову майбутнього. Робимо все для збереження нашої культурної спадщини і запрошуємо до співпраці всіх небайдужих.
First of all, I want to thank the presenters. What I've engaged with is both the presentations and both groups of presenters sent me some very rich materials in advance. And I'm going to be referring to those as well. Not all of that appeared in the paper. But I've got 4 themes that I thought, maybe in the spirit of dialogue, that I thought were common to both papers and that lead to questions across both papers. Theme number 1. I actually build on the last slide from Dr. Wanner and Kalenychenko's presentation, the theme of world breaking and world making, which featured in the paper and jumped out at me because it's a term that comes from the sociologist of religion, Peter Berger. I'm taking the term out of context, both of the paper and Berger, because I think it frames my comments nicely. I think both papers give us examples of world breaking, and then as a response, world making. World means to me a social world. It refers to cultural, symbolic, dialogical, and material elements. It describes the meaningful, effective spaces that hold people together in community. Right? So building a world is part of community building, society building. It provides what many sociologists and philosophers have called ontological security, a grounding for people's being. Both papers, of course, describe in detail how these worlds have been targeted in the Russian invasion, but especially and dramatically following the full-scale stage of the invasion. Dr. Poshyvailo demonstrated this most viscerally with tremendous imagery, the destruction of buildings, material places that both house secular and, of course, in the context of this conference, sacred culture. Doctors Wanner and Kalenychenko describe how war fractures social relations. Some of those ways were described here, but there's a much longer list in the paper of the way that society is broken. New conflicts are created, both now and potentially in the future. The references to civil war are particularly frightening. Worlds are also built through our capacity to dialogue with others. So when you destroy that capacity and create new conflicts, you're also destroying worlds. But for the rest of my 3 themes, I'm going to focus on world making, because I think both papers do a very good job of describing how that's done. So the first one focuses mainly on Dr. Wanner's and Kalenychenko's paper, Dialogue Across Difference. Drs. Wanner and Kalenychenko suggest that worlds are built in dialogue. At least that's one of the lessons I take from the paper. War exacerbates old tensions and creates new social tensions. And they propose that the best way, or at least one of the most productive ways of dealing with such tensions, is to develop a widespread social capacity for dialogue. It starts small and it starts locally. It's aimed at inclusivity. And this is the description of the Dialogue in Action initiative. Dialogue here does not seek closure or simple solutions, but rather rests on the principle, and this term wasn't introduced in the presentation, but I found it very powerful, agonistic pluralism, a term that comes from political theorist Chantal Mouffe. This is a recognition and respect for difference, living with tensions, but also not being consumed by those tensions and trending into violence. Now, a question that I have for the paper, much of the discussion of these dialogues seem to me to be focused on Christian communities, in particular the tensions around orthodoxy that we've heard talked about in this conference. But of course, earlier in today's conference, we've heard about Jewish communities, Muslim communities, Protestant Christian communities. I wonder whether those communities enter into the dialogues and what that looks like. This theme of plurality, I think, was also reflected in Dr. Poshyvailo's presentation. Harry has documented the destruction of temples from multiple faiths. Perhaps such destruction, and I guess at this point it's becoming conventional to refer to Dr. Scott Appleby's presentation from yesterday. He suggested that these kinds of common experiences of destruction across faiths might also offer an opportunity for the development of a common good. Okay, so far so good, but the second component of the argument in the paper as I read it is that religious clergy are best suited to mediate some dialogues. Coming partially from a psychological background myself, I struggled with this a little bit. Why not psychologists? Why not social workers? I think the answers are given in the papers. They have moral authority and the capacity to help and define the common good. Lots of other reasons for this, but the clergy also have experience and a language for dealing with issues of trust, hope, empathy, and the problem of evil. Right? This is built into the religious mindset, and I'll just make one hopefully quick sort of theoretical sociological reference here. Classical sociological theorist Georg Simmel, a German sociologist living at the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, describes different forms of life: scientific, artistic, political, and religious. And these are distinct ways of living and experiencing and relating to the world. From what I've heard from this conference, the religious seems to have, around the world, but also in Ukraine, been largely captured by the political. Now, Zimmel thinks there's value in retaining the religious form of life, because he thinks it's a form of life, and I found this interesting in the context of this paper, which talks about tensions and contradictions. He says it is the one form of life that is comfortable with and able to live with tension and contradiction. You don't get that anywhere else. So it leads me to a number of questions. How do you extricate this religious dimension, if we take Zimmel seriously, from the political dimension of religious? How can the clergy who lead these dialogues help to do this? To what extent can this broader spirit of religiosity enter into the dialogue? And I heard about the presence of the clergy, but I wonder about the degree to which a kind of spirit of religiosity in this Zimmelian sense enters into these dialogues. Okay, third theme, and this takes me to Dr. Poshyvailo's paper, sacred objects. So much more to say about that paper, and I can't cover any of it here, but I'm going to focus on this one topic. Worlds are built through dialogue, but they're also built through material culture. I would suggest that Dr. Poshyvailo is showing us that meaningful worlds also depend upon contact with sacred objects and symbols. Why rescue objects? Right? It seems obvious, but why? Why shelter and protect objects? I was most moved by a description in some of the material that Dr. Poshyvailo sent me before the presentation, where he described images you've all seen before of groups of cultural workers gathering together to barricade and protect monuments, a kind of collective effort to shelter these sacred heritage sites. Why shelter? Why museify? Why rescue museum collections? Well, because objects carry meaning. They are, to use the words of German philosopher Gernot Bohm, ecstatic. Objects, especially sacred objects, radiate meaningful energy, and when you rescue them, preserve them, keep them, there is, to connect to the theme of the conference, the promise that they will be there again to help us revive, transform, enliven our communities. This brings me to a question that I might ask of the first presentation. To what extent are the dialogues described by Drs. Wanner and Kalenychenko, to what extent do material objects and material spaces enter into those dialogues? Do those matter? Are those important? And in fact, I think this is probably the thing that struck me the most about both papers and what they had in common. And I'll call these communities of practice. Each paper in their own way describing the invention of new kinds of social practices and therefore new forms of sociality, of being together in the midst of war. Practice theory, if you're familiar with it, is something that develops in the 1980s across sociology, anthropology, other disciplines. It's an approach that focuses on analyzing how in the moment, step by step, in detail, right? There's a real spontaneity and kind of winging it to this. People working together build societies, and here societies is very local. Scientific laboratories, church communities, schoolrooms, and so on. These are, as Drs. Wanner and Dr. Kalenychenko emphasize, local practices. They are embodied. They are aware of problems that are close at hand. They also involve, I don't think Dr. Poshyvailo used the term here, but elsewhere he's used it, forms of self-organization. I think here he said responses to new and emergent problems. The question is what to be done in the moment. How do you respond in the moment where you've never done this before? And practice theory and this focus on practice is really good at dealing with this. Both papers showed me that self-organization includes not just getting local actors together to solve Ukrainian problems, but I was struck by the degree to which it involves integrating international actors and networks into the process. I don't think that came out in the first paper, but I know there are references to borrowing on the expertise from mediators abroad and integrating them into these local networks. Local authorities, who might act as gatekeepers, need to be integrated to your new kinds of social practice. Police and various government offices, who might play roles in prosecuting war crimes. Here's the last bit, and then I'm just about done. The networks also include the sophisticated integration of technology. And this was what was most striking about Dr. Poshyvailo's presentation. Use of geolocation to solve local problems. It's not easy to integrate these technologies into new kinds of museification and preservation practices. I was especially struck by the image of the person, the researcher in a lab in Virginia, who was nevertheless involved in preservation in some way in Ukraine. Okay, this brings me to my closing point. It's a recognition that inventing practices, building new forms of sociality is never easy for anyone, to say nothing of doing it in the midst of war. Right? I can't imagine. As both papers demonstrate, this world building involves long-term efforts, significant risk, long-term commitment, and very hard work. I want to end by saying I'm grateful for the work and world preservation work that Ukrainians, including all of our presenters today, are doing to build and preserve and keep up these worlds. So thank you.
We will collect questions from the floor to all our presenters.
I have a question to Katie and Tanya. I saw some recent polls showing the decline of trust to Ukrainian churches, the church as a social institution to Ukrainian religion. How can you explain this decline? Because, you know, last 20 years, the church was among first three most reliable, most trustworthy institutions in the country. And second, does it play against the idea that religious actors can play the major role in peace building?
I have two questions, one to Tanya and Katie, and one to Ihor. Maybe start with the one to Ihor. So I found it very interesting what you told about the Ukrainian Orthodox Church not interested in preserving icons left in the destroyed churches. I found it interesting that even here we find some possibility to somehow talk in not very well words about this church, which is so much under pressure in this situation. But I would like to get some context. So you told about 2 cases from 260 churches, I think, which are destroyed from this church. And I would like to know a little bit about, is this common for all these cases, or are these exclusions, or how to, just to get a little bit of understanding where we stand with this church in this horrible situation where there are so much buildings destroyed. The question to Tanya and Katie would be, I'm a little bit allergic maybe at the moment for the talk about the possibilities of religious communities and of priests probably, and clergy especially, in providing the kind of psychological help people need in this situation. We know it maybe from the German context very much that churches used to use a very toxic language and a quite huge amount of spiritual abuse of religious language. And I would never say that professional psychological help could be substituted by spiritual leaders in such a situation with so much trauma. So I would like to get a little bit your reflection on this and how you see this, because you worked so much now with these priests and with clergy and monastics maybe working with people, how much this is really helpful. And the second question somehow in connection with this would be, what would you expect from international religious communities to be helpful in this situation? Because I know a lot of the cases which are not helpful, for sure. Where would you see the need that religious communities or the theological academic field could be helpful to support what you try to do with Dialogue in Action and other initiatives in this way?
I have a question to Tanya and Kathy about the tension, the conflict between 2 Orthodox jurisdictions. You've been saying what other people have been saying also, that the conflict undermines social cohesion. Can you maybe explain a little bit more? So what do you expect might happen if this conflict keeps escalating as it has been? I think used the phrase civil war as a possibility. Can you develop a little bit on this, say how you see worst case scenario happening? Thank you.
Just a quick question for Tanya and Kathy. Might be drawing upon a previous presentation, but we have talked a little bit throughout the course of this conference about the Soviet legacy and de-Sovietization as one of the many Ds that are being pursued. And in the context of dialogue, of world building, of involving religious actors, I wonder if you could just briefly reflect on what kinds of obstacles the Soviet legacy and Soviet methods of psychology and of the use of psychiatric torture might be, how those might be playing out in the current context and looking ahead.
This is to Ihor. In the initial stages of the war, I think one of the things the international community was struck by was how quickly Ukraine knew how to contact international organizations, knew how to follow the procedures necessary for documentation and providing material abroad. Do you find now, with what we generally call Ukraine fatigue, that these same organizations are not as responsive now? And whether that is true or not, what do you think should be done to enliven it or increase the degree? And what can particularly be done by those of us who are abroad in these countries?
So this question's from Andrei Kravchuk. Thank you for a great presentation. One context of religious tensions and efforts to address them is the transition of parishes from the UOC to the OCU. What do you see as the main challenges and constructive interventions to ensure that such transfers will occur peacefully and legally? And follow-up, are there any particular insights regarding conflict and resolution in Russian-occupied areas that are subsequently liberated?
So thank you all for the questions, and I'm really happy to see our colleagues in the hall and listening to them. I will try to figure out two questions, getting Dmitros and Pavlos and Nicholas maybe questions together. And first, to start with Regina's question on psychology. I would like to stress the term of religious coping, the research which we're now working together with Dennis. So hopefully, as soon as you got Dennis in person, he can clarify more on what do we mean by that and what is possible to do in terms of trauma healing from religious perspective. From my perspective, what do we mean by a trauma healing in psychology for religious actors, at least for them to be conscious about what they're doing and what they're not doing well, and at least to recognize when it's trauma and to know that it's okay to send people to psychologists and they need some professional help. As soon as they're a trustable person to whom some traumatized people come and they need some responses, what to do and what is possible to do. And from my experience, there are some local religious leaders and also from monasteries, some public figures who are really good in responses. It's not like professional psychological help. It's more about talking on trauma, talking on grievances. And also there's a huge request from religious leaders on our side, why we started actually this religious coping topic. As soon as they don't know how to respond, and they're really scared and afraid on the scope of traumatized people, and they've got those people coming and asking, and they need to do something with that, especially for those mainly Orthodox priests in the Ukrainian world and perspective, those who get a lot of funerals and all the families coming, and how to respond to the grievance and how to still to support them. So it's not only about psychology as such, but at least to understand what they're doing, what they should do, and what it's better not to do at all. And definitely, of course, those who make damage, it's impossible to get them involved, but at least to respond to those who are interested in it. And that's a huge number of them because they're really afraid of trauma, and they've got their own trauma too. And in terms of international help, I think that's really possible also to share experiences of not only first spiritual aid, but mainly on theology, because definitely theology needs revision and theology needs discussion and discussion on hard dilemmas, but not like responding in general. So definitely I would say that's the main issue, to create safe spaces and safe discussions on this issue. And regarding trust and also Orthodox issue and general de-Sovietization, I would say, Nicholas, it's in general de-Sovietization of our culture of talking to each other. And that's actually what we've got, a lot of scary culture of ignorance, of being silent, of not trusting at all, even to your neighbor. So we've got it in our social landscape so far, and we need to overcome it somehow. But when we've got new cases of corruption, new cases of decrease of trust, even during the full-scale invasion, definitely it's really hard to do so. But at least it's possible to do in really small cases. Talking about a decrease of trust in your churches, and Dmitry, I would say it's, of course, we have no qualitative data we can pursue, but from my personal observations and talks with different people, I would say that's because of intra-Orthodox issue first, because it's much more not only about believers. And it was like another sign for society that we shouldn't trust those churches because they cannot talk to each other normally, and they use physical power to deal with issues. So they're not an examples of dialogue and law following rules. So it's mainly because also secular volunteers and army are much more in trust right now. So definitely they still get trusted and they still get their believers, and at least it's a start. But definitely talking about if conflict goes on, as Pavlo mentioned, I do not think we will get civil war, but we will get much more ignorance and silence in this issue, and we will get no resolution of it. So we'll just cover it again. And I don't know who should uncover that in years, because definitely we still get this problem and we need to talk about it, but we don't know who, how, and when it's possible to talk. So should we talk about our internal issues right now when we've got everyday shellings? I don't know. Should we wait for victory or till the end of war? But then we've got much more problems instead. So it's an open question, and definitely that would be much more decrease in trust. And I think that more people will leave Ukraine, and more people will be not publicly active and not trusting and acting against the state. So it's not like a way of rediscovering identity and world building, but more about divisions and separation inside society. Thank you so much for your attention. Unfortunately, I need to go, and I hope that next time I can be with you.
Tetiana, thank you very much for joining us today for this discussion. Catherine, you will be next.
So let me go right to the heart of the Civil War issue. After 2014, one struggled for vocabulary to describe what was going on. Personally, I use the term hybrid war. Whenever I could, I would insist on war. You heard all other people, conflict, tensions, all these other kind of very softer words. I mentioned in the presentation, I suspect some kind of hybrid peace is coming. What I mean by hybrid peace, it's not going to be the absence of violence. We don't know what form that violence is going to take. But I think putting out there the fact that left unchecked, and should this war carry on and measures not be taken now to address building social tensions, this would hardly be the first war that spilled over into a civil war. I really think one can't exclude that as a possibility. And if you don't exclude that as a possibility, then this goes back to what international actors can do. There's all kinds of things one can do now to potentially address what we see are concrete social problems so as to stem that possibility. I'm not saying there will be a civil war by any means, but I do think there's going to be something of a hybrid peace. What role will violence play in that? I don't know, but I don't think we're going into total peace. What role violence will play depends on what one does now. That's what I'm just trying to say is an important thing to keep in mind. So, Regina, as a theologian, if you have an allergic reaction to priests as psychologists, you can imagine my reaction as an anthropologist. I'm not suggesting that by any means. Having said that, as we all know, there's not the same practice as to going to a counselor, a psychologist, or a psychotherapist. Of course, a great many chaplains in war are called upon to be something of psychotherapists. And having spoken with many of them, they have very, very clearly expressed how much they regret that they don't don't have training in counseling, because that is precisely what they're called on to do. In warfare, that's one kind of context. Priests have other kinds of jobs. It's not providing psychotherapy. Among the reasons why we don't have the same tradition of psychologists and seeing a therapist when one feels troubled goes back to Nick's question about what has been, the very punitive legacy of mental health interventions. They tended to be coercive, punitive, and not always seen as helpful. And I might add, I run a program for scholars at risks that looks at, that ends up bringing Ukrainians to the US. And a premium has been put on psychologists precisely to increase the training of mental health professionals who will return to Ukraine to begin to answer what is clearly a deficit in psychologists and counselors trained in trauma healing. I don't think priests deserve or should take on that role. That also goes back to the spirit of religiosity and dialogue. I think you asked that question, Jeff. That doesn't really come up. There is sometimes an appeal to religious language, but nonetheless, the goal is not to address religiosity per se, but rather in a very concrete, sort of practical way. Religious institutions offer something of an infrastructure that allows for dialogues not only to happen regularly, but to happen more quickly. Circling back to Regina's question, I think on one level where things do have a sort of a psychological, emotional, positive effect is the whole notion of community, bringing people together. I do think that can have positive psychological effects. If you want to think of religiosity in that sense, that's where it then intervenes. And just to follow up on Dimitro's excellent question about trust. You're right, religious institutions used to come in very high. They either fell or remained flat, whereas other, armed forces, but even all kinds of government officials and government bodies, of course, the trust in them soared. Just as I think that high levels of trust in a variety of government officials is unlikely to remain at those levels, it doesn't have to be that trust remains very low, especially when one speaks comparatively. I do think that comparatively, in a longer-term effect, trust in religious institutions will mount. As a final point about minority participation, I mentioned in the paper this agnostic pluralism, and I think this sort of understanding that there are going to be tensions, problems, disputes, but if there's a commitment to live with those kinds of tensions, problems, disputes, and should one be able to really get a culture of dialogue, ecumenical kind of a dialogue, you can live with those antagonistic kind of tensions, one hopes. That's the effort. But I do think these kinds of dialogues benefit immensely from outsiders, whether those outsiders are international actors, whether they're minority religious community members at home, or simply non-members of local communities, somebody who doesn't live there. On all levels, outsiders almost always help.
Thank you for the questions concerning Regina's. It's very simple, especially for us who knows our context. The case I showed is exclusive, it's not normal. The situation is very typical, especially before the war. We had a lot of accidents when you've learned that churches are set on fire. Sometimes by accident, sometimes intentionally. Because there is a kind of a conflict between the clergymen, the religious community, and the church, for example, or a religious site, especially if the site is inscribed into a local or national monument list. Because there are some strict rules, and mostly clergymen, they're very practical on the one hand. They want the building to make less investments. But with all buildings, it's a problem. Also, there is a conflict of education, maybe, and empathy to the history, to the past of these villages, especially those Ukrainian Orthodox Church clergymen. They do not favor the Ukrainian tradition and non-canonical paintings of folk icons, for example, which are a part of this or that church environments. And therefore, they do not pay much attention, and sometimes they are neglected on the attics. Luckily, some museum or folklore expeditions help to rescue them and to bring them to museums, for example. We were really shocked because no attention. Also, another challenge is that those monuments in the inventories, they have so-called double ownership. Officially, they belong to the government, local or central, but they're given to religious communities for usage. And sometimes local or central government don't want to pay much attention. They say, okay, it's the religious community, they are responsible for everything. They took care, but formally, according to the law, it is not so. So there is no anyone so responsible for any kind of situation. That's among the many situations absolutely different. Like in Lukashivka, I showed you the church, brick church, completely destroyed inside, but the local clergymen self-organized the local community and they provide sermons even outside. They invested a lot of local efforts for reconstruction, for early recovery, to make some parishes to practice and come back to normality. Concerning this question of international coordination, support and fatigue, there is no fatigue. At least I don't see the fatigue from our international partners, vice versa. They are ready to provide as much support as possible because, according to many estimations, Ukrainians behaved much better than, for example, our colleagues in other contexts. For example, in Afghanistan, for example, in Iraq, in Syria. They are ready to provide us their support. Vice versa, there is fatigue from Ukrainian side because a lot of cultural activists, they are getting burnt out, they really fatigue, and not much people left in sites, for example, in that small locations, if we speak about the regions. Speaking about the methodologies and international support, our partners shared us a lot of international methodologies for damage assessment, for risk assessment, for preparation for early recovery, for stabilization. We had a lot of trainings, workshop. There are international coalitions have been formed recently who include international organizations and national representatives from Ukraine. So at the moment we have a lot of the window of opportunity so brief for Ukraine. The other question is what we do in this situation when there's no stability. And for example, the most important is stabilization. If we speak about material culture, immovable objects, stabilization of the objects, because they had to survive until reconstruction and rebuild will take place. But the front line is unfortunately so dynamic, and not many donors are ready to invest money for reconstruction. They invest in stabilization and developing capacities, individual, institutional. So at this moment, I would say that international cooperation is very beneficial for Ukrainian side because we really reopen quite new fields of knowledge, of science, which was not relevant, considered not relevant to Ukraine before the war. Of course, it's possible. On the side of the Ministry of Culture and Informational Policy in particular, there was a lot of information about what objects need support. There are some even cost estimations, some drafts. We have National Council for Reconstruction. There are a lot of individual grassroots initiatives, not so much so they are well known by international communities or individuals who are engaged in supporting Ukraine from the very first days. There are international organizations like e-commerce, like ICOM, like ICROM. So they are also very active and present in Ukraine. There are international donors, the biggest, the most important, like ALIF Foundation, like Cultural Emergency Response, and Prince Claus Fund from the Netherlands. So in the United States, there is Smithsonian Institution, of course. So there are some, at least up to 10 international donors in different countries. They are very, very involved, and they know those people, organizations, institutions who can be credited in providing the money. Or any kind of support, but not only financial support is important, but also expertise, sharing the knowledge, and even sometimes bringing conservators, for example. A lot of suggestions to bring, like interns, students, conservators, because we have a big demand to mitigate the damage to movable collections, but our legislation is not open because a lot of certification level, very bureaucratic. And also, last words. What's the biggest support we need today? We need to reform Ukraine, to make our legislation much more harmonized with European or international laws, to facilitate this reform of Ukraine and to make our government and our less bureaucratic.
There's so much work ahead in so many domains. Thank you so much to all the four presenters.